and how do we amplify if we do have something that the market's responding to? That's what the challenge the accelerator program's trying to solve.
Welcome to the Food Grads Podcast, the podcast that takes you on a fascinating journey into the hearts and minds of the amazing people who work in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. My name is Veronica, and I am a PhD candidate studying fat-based food emulsions. On this podcast, we share insights from professionals at all stages of their careers, find out what they do, why they do it, and how they are changing the food world one day at a time. So no matter what your passion is, there's always something for everyone in food, and we'll help you find it. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Food Grads Podcast. It's Veronica. On today's episode, we are talking about entrepreneurship, Canada's food landscape, and how Ventureparks is helping to support small startups. Our guest today is Mike McNeil, Vice President of Operations at Venturepark Labs. Venturepark Labs is a nonprofit supporting early-stage entrepreneurs in the food and wellness categories. It was initially founded in 2015 as District Ventures Accelerator and District Ventures Kitchen by Canadian business icon Arlene Dickinson. In May 2021, this initiative became Venturepark Labs, a proud community within Venturepark, Canada's only business growth ecosystem. Mike began his career as an advisor to Canada's Minister of Finance, the Honourable Jim Flaherty, but soon discovered a passion for entrepreneurship. As the first hire at Venturepark Labs, Mike established the Accelerator program as one of Canada's leading programs for entrepreneurs. To date, the program has supported over 130 entrepreneurs and contributed to over $1 billion in economic output. In 2023, Mike was named one of the best executives in Canada by the Globe and Mail. This episode of the podcast is powered by Careers Now. Careers Now is Food and Beverage Ontario's multi-year workforce development initiative that is connecting students and job seekers with employers in Ontario's food and beverage processing industry for exciting career opportunities. Check out careersnow.ca for more information on exciting jobs, career information, industry mentors, and training opportunities for professional development. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for taking time to come on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited with you coming on the show, with Ventureparks just being on my radar for so long. And there's so many great brands that have gone through your program. And it's amazing to see how they've progressed since then. And it's great to have someone who's on that team helping to facilitate that journey. So I think we're in for a good conversation.
I think so too. Yeah, it's great to speak with you, and I hope I bring a unique perspective, having been with the organization since day one, but also left and become an entrepreneur and come back. So I'm really happy to share what I've learned and talk more about what we're doing at Venturepark.
I have been really excited about what's been going on in the food space in the past few years. Like, there's all these different brands that are coming out with their unique ideas, other maybe coming from their childhood, or maybe something coming from their family, or just even like new takes on healthier things. And it's such an exciting place to be in the food space. So I think that you can introduce yourself better than I can. So why don't you introduce yourself to our audience and tell a little bit about your story?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I started my career actually working in federal politics, so I didn't have any experience in the food or consumer packaged goods space or even entrepreneurship. I was a political staffer that got my minister coffee and worried about scheduling, and basically just running around center block, trying to put out fires and learn as much as I could. And after 3.5 years of doing that, my minister, who was the Minister of Finance at the time, unfortunately passed away. And it kind of created this, I guess, personal crisis of what am I going to do when I grow up? And now I have to figure that out, because as much as I loved politics and I like things that move really, really quickly at a fast speed, it probably wasn't something I was going to do for the rest of my life. It was, something that was meeting my needs for working in exciting environments and having a larger impact, but I was always kind of desiring something more. And so that situation of just my minister suddenly passing away, and I was really looking to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I got connected with a former colleague of mine who worked with me in politics and then was working with Arlene Dickinson, who was one of the dragons on Dragon's Den and still is now. And he was mentioning, I work with Arlene on the marketing side, but she's trying to get more involved in creating an investment fund and an accelerator program for food and beverage and health and wellness entrepreneurs, and nothing like that existed in Canada at the time. Everything then and largely today is still very much focused on how do we find that next big tech unicorn and how can we make that happen in Canada. And Arlene was very much thinking everybody's focused there, but we're missing a real opportunity to support entrepreneurship in Canada that utilizes our agricultural sector, that creates products that we use on a day-to-day basis. And that was her big familiarity as both a marketer and an investor in the space from her time on Dragon's Den. So without having any experience at all in that industry, I got connected with Arlene based on just kind of a personal recommendation. And I think Arlene just decided to take a chance on me and was, if you can move across the country and start this initiative with me as quickly as we can, because Arlene had already built a physical space for this program to exist. Her thinking was that, if I could go out there and create some early momentum for this, I would both prove that I had what it takes to do that job. And then she would also benefit from the program and resource getting it into the market as quickly as possible. So I did exactly that. I left federal politics quite quickly. I joined Arlene in Calgary. I think I had spoken to her, the Monday before, and I think the following Wednesday, so just 2 days, I was up in the Best Western in Calgary, living there, and then reporting to work on Thursday. And that was just like such an excitement to work with Arlene, but also to do something new and exciting. And I hadn't done that before. So back then we were called District Ventures Accelerator, and we got a lot of partnerships. I was cold calling entrepreneurs on a daily basis to get as many people that we could to be a part of this initial cohort. And by October, we'd already launched our first cohort, and I had already moved out there by July. So just 2 months of getting this off the ground, we had raised a bunch of capital to get the program started. And at that point, we were just learning how to run an accelerator program, and we looked towards what was working in tech, and we tried to apply some of those principles to what we're doing in Calgary. Some of it worked, some of it absolutely didn't. But after a few iterations of it, we definitely had something. And from there, we were able to raise an investment fund, which Arlene now manages today, called District Ventures Capital. And that's a $100 million investment fund that's investing in the food and beverage, health and wellness space. And they're just going through the process of closing their second fund. But in between that process of running an accelerator program, I became more and more in love with entrepreneurship. And so I actually joined one of the accelerator companies that went through our first cohort. It was a company called Purple Frog that was doing really, really, really well, and seemed like a natural kind of, okay, if you're going to join a company that's early stage and doing quite well, that was one of the standouts. But then a few weeks before I had actually made that jump, their number one product was recalled by Health Canada just because of a regulatory change. So as a result, joining like a really high growth company towards joining a company that's now, how do we navigate bankruptcy and go through the process of raising capital and reestablishing like distribution, which was stressful, but I learned more in that opportunity that I've learned elsewhere in my career. And we were able to reposition the company, get it on its feet, and raise some capital. And I actually invested some of my own capital into that business and became a partner in that company around 2018. And at that point, it became, looking for the next opportunity. I was becoming a dad for the first time. And I found this amazing opportunity of being the president of the Craft Brewers Association here in Alberta, which, Alberta's craft scene was just exploding. There was like 13 craft brewers in the province in 2013. And by 2017, there was over 120.
Oh my God.
So the market was just exploding and very saturated. And a lot of people have taken out, loans or refinanced their house into idealizing that dream of becoming a brewer and having their own brewery, which is great. But also the market was also becoming a bit saturated. There was a lot of players in certain markets that probably couldn't support that many entrepreneurs in the craft beer space. So while the industry was growing and more Albertans were falling in love with craft beer, it was also, okay, there's a lot of businesses that are probably fledgling now because some of the investment hasn't been supported by, some of the consumers converting from traditional beer drinkers into craft beer. So that was a really interesting time because you had an industry that was like going through this huge shift. And I worked with them to kind of navigate the regulatory environment to make it easier to be a craft brewer, and then to also try to establish an even playing field across the different provinces. Because for an Alberta brewer, it's an open market. They've got independent alcohol distribution points across the province, whereas like Ontario, you've got the LCBO, in the beer store, they control a lot of what goes into the province, and they typically have a preference towards locally made beer. So it was very challenging for Alberta brewers already in a very competitive category to also compete against everybody else in the country that could sell in Alberta. So I was tasked with kind of helping improve the regulatory environment and trade environment interprovincially amongst Alberta and some of its provincial counterparts. And then I got a call probably 3 months into COVID, and I was a sleep deprived new dad. I got a call from Arlene, and it was like, I need you to come back. And at that point, District Ventures had now closed an investment fund. It had an accelerator program that was on its ninth cohort, and then it had inherited a commercial kitchen in Toronto, which used to be Food Starter, and that it took over operations from the city of Toronto. Then it was like, okay, let's come back and build what we were doing, but also get it through COVID, which is extremely challenging. And also like figure out this shared kitchen, which has been a challenge for both Food Starter, the city of Toronto, and us as well, but provides such amazing value for early stage entrepreneurs. And that's really got me further into the food side of things. So over the last 3 years, there's been so many challenges with COVID, but we've also grown quite significantly what we do for entrepreneurs. And then that food facility, which I've personally have fought so hard for over the last 3 years, has evolved into something I think really unique within the food ecosystem, and has gotten me connected with so many great organizations within Ontario that are supporting food entrepreneurship. So my day-to-day is to kind of oversee all the different areas that we support entrepreneurs in, including helping ideate new products, get them onto store shelves, and then ideally help facilitate their growth through connections to investors, mentorship, networking. And so all told, we now support 130 entrepreneurs, whereas back in 2015 when we started, we were doing about 10 to 15 entrepreneurs annually.
That is amazing. Wow. I mean, the first thing that definitely stands out to me is the fact that you switched from politics to the more entrepreneur side, which for many people seem like total opposites. They usually feel like they're going head to head, but it's amazing all the different things that you have experienced over the years, especially doing that really quick change going into at the time District Ventures. But particularly what stood out to me as well is that Arlene had really thought about the Canadian. For the purpose of this conversation, I'll mention a lot the food space, even though I do know that
Hey.
it's the full total CPG, because that has been something that's been a little bit of a conundrum with the Canadian food space, is that we're known for being much an exporter of our goods. So a
Mhm.
lot of things will be shipped out to another country just to come back and sold to Canadians rather than really cultivating the space to make it within Canada rather than going out there. So it's amazing that she stuck with that idea and really has been pushing through it for all these years.
Yeah, I agree. I hope I'll send her this podcast so she can listen to us, give her some kudos, because I really do think that nobody else in Canada has stepped up like Arlene has for this space, and nobody has paid a bigger price for it in terms of just the emotional investment of making this happen. It's not an easy space to attract investment into. Capital in Canada it's restricted during the best of times, but economically where we are right now, obviously with high interest rates, there's a lot of uncertainty around everything with respect to food. And because Arlene, I think, has really put her brand out there to attract investors to then learn what investing in a food company looks like and what kind of returns they can expect. And also, to your point, the economic benefits of doing that within Canada is an exercise in both pulling private and public partners and basically pulling them along and saying, we need to do this. And that's not an easy process. And it's been, close to 8 years of Arlene doing that day in and day out. So I very much admire her for that. It's one of the reasons I was so drawn, I think, to work for her immediately, is just Arlene's somebody that just like faces the adversity and makes it happen, which is a true like entrepreneur. But, Arlene she's obviously been successful in business, but this is the real passion of hers. Like, she just is committed to making this space work here in Canada. And so I'm glad we can celebrate her for that, because I don't think she gets the credit that she deserves for it.
Absolutely. But why is the case that the food space is more difficult? When you think about food, it's something that everyone has to consume. So there's always a market for food, maybe unlike tech and such. But Why is it a little bit more difficult to gain capital on food as opposed to other industries?
Well, it's a very expensive business to start. Well, I'll preface that. It's not a very expensive business to start if you're doing like your first production run out of your home or shared kitchen. There are ways that you can kind of just prove the concept, but then eventually, once you want to make something out of your product, it becomes very, very capital intensive. You either have to make a decision of investing lots of money, probably millions of dollars into building out your own facility to make a product that could scale from both a like a manufacturing standpoint, but also a regulatory standpoint in Canada. It's become more and more regulated, which understandably, but that creates more and more expenses for entrepreneurs. Or you have to scale through getting a co-manufacturer, someone to make your product for you, which, the minimum orders on that is quite significant. So either way, you're kind of hitting a wall. Um,
Mm.
as a result, that requires that you need to kind of pull in more and more capital. And as I mentioned before, like Arlene's kind of the first in this space to really get an institutional fund to dial in on this space in Canada. But there still needs to be more active investors along the different steps of investing. So a VC is probably not going to invest in a company that's, just doing about 100 grand in annual revenue. They want to see that company progress a little bit further. So it's a little bit less risky, although it's always risky to invest in early stage companies. At that stage, you need somebody that's probably going to cut you a smaller check that either knows you personally or knows the space really, really well. And because there isn't that kind of ecosystem in Canada really marked out as well as there is with tech, you often get entrepreneurs kind of hitting a wall earlier than they probably should. So, because the business is so expensive to start and scale, and because there's a real lack of capital to invest in entrepreneurs each way across the value chain as they continue to grow, you get kind of a scenario in which that can't be sustainable for growth like there is in tech. Whereas, if I was starting a tech company and I just have an idea, I could probably, convince at some point some other tech entrepreneurs that either believe in me or if I have established track record of, scaling a business. You can raise some capital just on that early stages. With the food business, you really can't. Like it's very product market fit driven. Somebody's probably going to buy the product or not. You sell it in retail, you can point to some sort of sales data and say, the company's doing X, Y, or Z. Whereas tech, and this is probably before the recent economic downturn, was a little bit more, I guess, there's a little bit more opportunity to pitch to investors and pulling capital along the way as you grow the company. Just hasn't happened with the food space. And I think it's predominantly because it is quite expensive, but there's lots of other reasons as to why. But that's the challenge because to your point, we need food in Canada. We've got a
Yeah.
food security issue and it's a problem. That's why I think it's so integral that Arlene is working to solve it, but we need other people to come to the table to make it happen as well.
Okay, so that makes a little bit more sense. And then I guess a lot of tech, and then this is also pointing out that I might not know as much as tech as I should. I guess with tech as well, it's just not a physical, in a lot of cases, it's not a physical product as much, not that it can't be, but it's, it can be online software, like that whole space where something like food at the end of the day, it is a physical space that needs physical product to be grown, physical product to manufacture, and then obviously the retail space to actually sell it. So I guess that as well is a big difference.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there's lots of steps along the way to actually get your product to the consumer when you're in a food product. I mean, you've got to, if you're looking at the retail channel, you've got to find a distributor typically to take your product. Distributor needs to get your product into the doors of, the Sobeys, Metros of the world. And all of that, you're kind of giving up margin along the way, right? They need to be incentivized to carry the product as well. So as a result, the expensive growth for food it adds up really quickly. And as a result, and that's even if you're not even considering the cost of materials going up with inflation and supply chain issues and climate change, which are increasing costs for everybody along the way of that value chain.
Yeah, I know that's the unfortunate. I mean, and that's also where we definitely need more people coming into the space, maybe not from the product side, but making a more resilient supply chain, all those intricacies in the middle. But I'm not sure if you'd be able to comment, is the food space here in Canada different than that in the United States? Like, are there big differences in terms of how the ease of someone maybe starting a small business and scaling it in the States, is there differences here than compared to there?
I always look at it from the perspective of the entrepreneur side, of like growing the business side of things. And as I mentioned, getting experience in the food industry has been gradual throughout my time with Venturepark, but over the past 3 years of really taking over the food manufacturing facility, I've gotten to know a lot of these like regulatory pieces, which are really challenging for like early stage entrepreneurs, I think, to navigate. I understand why they're in place, and there's no disputing probably the need for having enhanced criteria for like traceability and that sort of thing. But it is challenging for an early stage company more so than like for a large company that has consultants and millions of dollars to invest in software and platforms that can help manage that. So I think the key difference between Canada and the US, and I'm less familiar with the US regulatory environment, I would say though, it's just the geography of Canada is very challenging to grow an early stage business as opposed to the US, just from the simple dynamics of like population. So
Mm.
Canada's got over, close to 40 million people, and it's all spread across this kind of the border with the US predominantly, where I think like 90% of the population is, but it's spread across like multiple time zones, different geographic components of Canada. It's very expensive to grow a brand across Canada, particularly in the food space. If you can just think of like the logistics of actually growing within like a state like California, it's much smaller space than Canada, but reaching the same amount of population. As a result, like your costs in theory should be a lot less in terms of distribution in manufacturing. So I think that a US food brand, if they were starting out, is going to naturally have an advantage just because the Canadian market is so spread out and challenging from a logistical standpoint. In Canada, it's become even more challenging with some of like the regulatory framework that I was talking a little bit about before. It's now a little bit more challenging for entrepreneurs to actually ship their product out of province if they're self-manufacturing, which, for somebody that oversees a shared manufacturing facility like we do, this kind of project was ideated back in like 2015. The city started this resource, City of Toronto. And back then we didn't have a lot of the regulatory framework that would make it necessary for you to control like every aspect of your food production and be able to account for that. You get some of these certifications that are now required to grow out of province. So if you wanted to manufacture at our facility in Toronto, it'd be really, really challenging, though not impossible, but very challenging and expensive for an early stage company to say, okay, I'm going to go through the process of getting certified from a regulatory standpoint, from a health and safety standpoint, to meet some of these more advanced requirements so that I can ship my product out of Ontario. And as a result, you're kind of limiting the growth of these companies as well. So from an ecosystem perspective, that just means we have to kind of change the way that we operate and the value that we provide so that we can make it easier for these brands that are, just trying to scale from a sustainable cost standpoint before going out and having to raise millions of dollars or invest their own money to growing their business just to get some sales to validate and justify that level of investment. I think it's challenging more so in Canada just because of the way we've evolved both from a regulatory standpoint and just kind of the nature of our country being so spread out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm definitely going to dive more into how Venturepark Labs is supporting these businesses, but I just have to ask about the certifications because I'm only aware of what type of certifications are we talking about, like from the CFIA, because I know you need, for example, a HACCP plan from the
Mhm.
food safety standpoint, but what other regulations are there? Like if you are located in Alberta and then you want to sell to Ontario and you are a non-alcoholic beer, let's say, for example, what other certifications would you need?
Well, so the big thing I was kind of referencing is the Safe Food for Canadians Act, which is kind of it's changed the way a lot of these companies need to create like a health and safety, food and safety plan, where they didn't necessarily need to do that level of investment early into their business before expanding. And it's different for different categories. So a beverage product is probably going to have a different process than someone that's like making, like a cookie or something in our shared facility. But where it's become challenging is that like a shared facility, particularly the one we had in city with the city of Toronto, they established, is meant to be kind of that low barrier space where it's like, okay, do you push the cookie metaphor even further? It's like, okay, well, I want to just make my product locally, and I want to either test it at farmers markets or I want to get in some of the local programs that are available through some of the retail channels in Ontario. And I want to do that before investing in either my own space or going to a co-packer and saying, hey, I've got this huge demand for my product. I want to invest in like a minimum order. Those two steps, I think, were naturally like a shared food facility like ours met that need because you could basically, you get an order, you manufacture it. You get an
Hmm.
order, then you manufacture it. And you could do that yourself through a production run. You can rent our kitchen just on an hourly basis and grow within it. So if you needed more space, you could rent more space. And that gave you a little bit of a less risky way to grow a food brand. Now, in order for that kind of journey of that entrepreneur to continue, it's either they have to invest lots of money in either controlling their own space within a shared space. So can they control every aspect of their manufacturing space? In a shared space, that's really challenging to do because somebody could be using the same dishwashing area that you're using. Then you have to kind of account for the way that they use it within your process. And if they don't use it correctly, then it kind of violates your food safety plan. It's very similar to like HACCP, right? And a lot of entrepreneurs in our space are trying to go through the process of HACCP because those requirements are very similar. And as a result, you kind of reach this threshold where it's like either you invest a lot of money to stay within a shared space and make that work, or you invest a lot of money in either going to a co-packer or a building out your own facility. Both are very capital intensive, and your business may not be at the level yet where it's going to attract investment capital to enable you to do that. So that's the kind of the challenge we see, like, okay, we're putting a lot of these regulatory pieces in place and for good reason, but
Hmm.
the way they impact very early stage companies is very different than a large scale company because they of course have likely in-house expertise or a budget to attract people to walk them through each step of that process and figure out what it means for them. These early stage companies, I mean, the person running the business is probably likely also the person that's doing the manufacturing, that's doing the sales, that's doing the marketing. It's one more thing that they have to kind of invest in. And as a result, some of the infrastructure that we have, the reason we took over the space is because it's very essential for like 50 food entrepreneurs that use it annually to go through that exact process that I outlined to start a food business in a low barrier space without having to attract capital, without having to try to advance their business too quickly before they have to either invest their own money or attract investors to take that next step. And the regulatory environment just puts way more pressure on them to do that sooner. And it might not be actually right sized to where they're actually at from a business perspective.
That makes a lot more sense. And I mean, obviously, with this podcast existing, I have interviewed many of those individuals who are at these bigger companies who that is their role to be in the food safety side, to be on the regulatory side, to really just hone in, and that is their full-time job. And like you said, many of these entrepreneurs, they're not quite at that stage to have an individual be a full-time person, and I can see why that would be challenging. So let's bring that back to venture parks and how one of the things that I most notably know is that you have an accelerator program as well as a concept to market sprint. So maybe you could
Mhm.
be able to comment about those two different programs and how comment on the concept to market sprint and how those are helping entrepreneurs.
Yeah. So the accelerator program is kind of our first foray into supporting entrepreneurs, and we're structured as a not for profit, and then we're partnered with Arlene's investment fund. And the partnership is really about, we have companies that go through the accelerator program that are probably at the stage where they have the product now in, like, use the example, Sobeys is our big retail partner that we work really closely with entrepreneurs that are going through their local program. Inevitably, once they get some traction there, they want to go national or they want to get into other retailers, and growth is expensive. And you're also simultaneously trying to figure out how to meet that market demand through manufacturing your product directly or working with a co-packer. All that's very expensive. So we work with the fund team to both potentially make some connections with companies that are ready to work with an investor. We also help companies that if they're like too early for the fund, because the fund is a VC venture capital fund, which typically works with more later stage companies, will help them connect with some angel investors or a community that understand the space. But really, we're focused on at that level of programming, like scalability. Can we make the product that has some more regional or local traction, some initial sales to really take that next step to ideally becoming a national brand? And through that program, We've worked with over 100 entrepreneurs. It's been very successful in being that first step into building out an ecosystem for these types of companies here in Canada. And as a result, it's created about a $1 billion economic impact. And the companies that have graduated that program have now exceeded about $200 million in annual revenue collectively. So we've had some companies that have done really, really well. We've, of course, have companies that gone to the program, like every other early stage business. Some of them succeed and some of them don't over a period of time, but we've seen the vast majority of them have a significant impact on the economy, which is really great. And as a result of that, it used to be based out of Calgary, where now it's more national focused. We've actually doubled down and doubled the number of entrepreneurs that are working through that program now. So we'll have a cohort that works out of Calgary and we'll have a cohort that works out of Toronto. It gives us the ability to work with more entrepreneurs through that program. And there's also a lot of value of entrepreneurs like going through similar challenges. Maybe they're in the food space and other entrepreneurs in the health and beauty, but ultimately the challenges of growing a CPG business are quite similar from how do we get cash flow into this business to make it sustainable? And how do we amplify if we do have something that the market's responding to? That's what the challenge the accelerator program's trying to solve. We have grown beyond that to now launch a concept to market sprint boot camp that was initially offered out of our food incubator facility, which I mentioned we took over in 2019 after the city of Toronto put out a call for applicants. Once food started, their organization had ceased to exist. We really wanted to get involved in like new product innovation because there are a lot of like Me Too products in our industry in CPG. I mean, there's lots of products you see quite regularly kind of repeat themselves. So at that point, like figuring out how to dial in on your value proposition to identify why you're unique and how you can stand out, it's much easier to do that at the very early formative stages of product development. So Marlis, who leads that program, did product development for Safeway for a number of years. She understands all those things I was talking about with, food safety, the regulatory environment, much better than I ever will. That's the area that she just lives and breathes. And she imparts that knowledge on the companies at the very early stages of figuring out, okay, they want to make a product, but is it actually something that could be made here in Canada from both a regulatory standpoint and a scalability standpoint? Could you realistically find a co-packer? Here's what it would look like if you actually did self-manufacturing. Is there a path towards profitability? All that stuff is figured out through a very intensive 6-week program with Marlis, who leads that. And amazingly, she supported the development of over 200 products already. And we've had that program since 2021, which is great because now we see them actually start to go through the accelerator program, get on the store shelves of Sobeys. It's really, really great. And then on a day-to-day basis, we also run the food incubator facility, which is a 20,000 square foot facility based out of North York. As I mentioned before, it's had a few different operators, but we've now officially, since November 4th, operated the longest. And it is essentially a necessary space for entrepreneurs just to get started in the food manufacturing space because the barrier to entry is just so high elsewhere. If you're going to go directly to a manufacturer to make your product for you, it's going to be quite expensive and require a lot of upfront capital. Here, you can test the concept. You can, as you get more orders, as you get more traction with your product, you can rent the space. It's much more friendly towards kind of controlling a lot of your operational costs early on. And then you reach a certain point where we're just not the right fit for you, either from like a regulatory standpoint, as I mentioned, or just from a size capacity. It becomes more economical for you to actually operate your own facility at some points, the way we're structured, if you continue to grow throughout the products, throughout the business journey. So as a result, we graduate companies quite regularly from the facility. And they ideally go on to either build their own facility or work with a co-packer. And then you start to see that kind of economic development narrative where we help them get started, but now they're actually going out and buying lots of raw materials, hiring lots of people to make their products. And then you kind of see a lot of these early stage companies make a real impact on their local economy, which is great. But it's not easy to run a food manufacturing facility, as I've learned. So it's one of those things I think is just sorely needed. But it is a very challenging project to oversee just because you've got 50 entrepreneurs with different food standards, with different approaches to their business, with different objectives, all using the same space. And sometimes like their approaches will like conflict with other people's approaches. So it becomes a space of like, okay, we've got to create like a common community because the space is only going to work if everybody uses it and buys into the community that's trying to be established there. So I've learned a lot I've learned a ton over the last 3 years running a shared manufacturing facility.
I absolutely can tell. And the fact that all this has happened in a relatively short amount of time to be able to support businesses from the initial stage, middle stage, and then starting to get a little more to the scaling, like the needs of so many individuals are so different across the page. And I can imagine that, like you said, you have learned a lot. And I'm guessing for you, that learning has just been on a day to day basis in terms of this week, we're learning how to deal with maybe the capital side of it. How do we grow that? But then the next side is just the nuts and bolts of planning for each of the days. Like, how do you coordinate all these different individuals?
hmm just like any other organization, we've grown quite a bit since 2015, and we've gone through the challenges just like any other business that we worked with of COVID and inflation and the cost of living increasing and the cost of doing business increasing. It's really been a period since 2020, since I've come back, of just extreme change, right? And very consistent variability in what to expect in terms of, our business operates as a not-for-profit, just from a perspective of our main goal is economic development. And then a lot of our partners along the way, they see the value of investing in the space, and particularly in reference to the kitchen, like it's such a low barrier space in terms of allowing people to actually get started into food entrepreneurship. So I see it as a really important value add for what it's doing. But we are constantly evolving and figuring out what to do differently, and figuring out what works and what doesn't. And that's what our team, I think, all buys in on, is this consistent improvement and figuring out how we can be better and what are ways to improve. And that you've really seen that with projects like the kitchen, whereas 3 years ago it was like extremely challenging, but now there's a strong community there, and we continue to kind of take steps to figure out where food entrepreneurs today, and they're in a very different spot than they were 3 years ago. So we keep changing our approach along the way as well.
Well, one of the things that stood out to me in one of the past interviews that you did is that many of the businesses that when they go through venture parks is that they actually still have weekly goals. So you would think that you wouldn't be able to pinpoint. So the thing that I'm referring to is that I was told that each business, as they go through the program, will have weekly goals. So this might be this week you focus on your packaging, or this week you focus on your scalability for this type of market. Has this always been the case of the approach of helping the entrepreneurs, or has this changed over time? And does it change according to the different businesses that you work with?
Well, the entrepreneurs that are in our programs and focus on the accelerator concept to market are with us with only for a short period of time, like comparatively. And one of the main kind of great aspects of running a good business is creating a culture of accountability, and not so much accountability being like you didn't do what you say you're going to do, and somebody's going to be fired for that. That's probably a byproduct of not having a day-to-day structure that enables you to kind of get in front of issues with your business. So when I've come back, the way I ran the organization back in 2015, the way I ran it when I came back in 2020 is like night and day. First of all, I didn't really know what I was doing in 2015, and I'm okay to, because it's worked out, admit that. But now that I had the opportunity to go out and learn from other entrepreneurs when I was with Purple Frog and other entrepreneurs when I was the Craft Brewery Association. It's so important, I think, to have businesses aligned around like a common vision, so that everybody across the organization kind of figure out what's happening and why it's happening. And so I adopted that approach when I came back to Venturepark the second time, about figuring out a shared vision, shared common values amongst the team, and then to figure out the process of actually figuring out material ways in which we can get better. And we try to model that to the businesses that we work with. So each entrepreneur that goes to like the accelerator program will have a weekly meeting with like their advisor, our executive in residences. These are like established people in the industry that are motivated to give back and make the path a little bit easier for early stage companies. Now, they aren't like accountability coaches to say, hey, did you do this or did you not? You're in trouble or you're letting yourself down. What we're trying to do is model the behavior of like on a weekly basis, have some sort of check-in. You could be a solo entrepreneur, or you could have a team of just, a small amount of people working on your business, but it's so important to have time set aside on a weekly basis to work on your business, because you're always working in it. And to actually meaningfully grow a business, that everyone else can be a part of. That's not just an entrepreneur kind of going out and chasing sales, which, nothing against that. That is a lot of, that's typically what happens a lot for early stage companies.
Mhm.
But the companies that have strong teams, have strong cultures, and have people that are feeling good about working probably for less compensation they get elsewhere because they feel like they're a part of something is somebody that has like an actual vision that they're giving to their team. And then having some sort of weekly pulse, either through a meeting or a connection to with our mentor about figuring out what did we do over the last week that got us a little bit closer to where we want to be 3 years from now. And without that structured time, it's just very challenging because you get swept up with making your product, uh, putting out fires, trying to get everyone paid. That sort of stuff takes up a lot of your time. So what we do through our programs is try to create a little bit of rhythm so that the entrepreneur knows that they have this certain amount of time to work on their business, to figuring out what progress did they make and what areas of the company are working and what areas need support. Without that, I mean, you often get entrepreneurs that are kind of just focused on so much of the day to day and early stage. Since you're wearing so many hats, you will lose sight on what the long term vision for your business is. So that's something we operate organizationally at Venturepark, but we also try to instill that with the companies that we work with.
I really like that. That stands out to me so much because it's almost like an analogy to life where you can get
Mhm.
swept up in the day-to-day of life and then you're kind of here a few years later realizing, "Oh, this wasn't the path that I quite wanted because I was dealing with the day-to-day," and it my the consistency of life is that little habits or little actions, if you keep doing them over and over, they can push you into a negative direction or a positive direction depending on what your overall goals are, and you might not even notice you're going off track because it's easy to say, "Well, I had to deal with this." If you're going with, again, the business, oh, it's easy to deal with the day-to-day of the vendor or maybe, "Oh, I have to talk with this vendor today," but you get so caught up in that that you're not realizing, "Oh, I've been off track with my regulatory," and it's a real struggle to push it all together, so it's really good to know that Venture Park is assisting with those types of things because you don't wanna get off track, and it's so easy, especially if you haven't been in the space for very long.
Yeah, exactly. And the difference between like a leading and lagging indicator is so true, particularly in this industry, because by the time you get into like a large account like Sobeys, you've taken so many steps to actually get there. And the steps that you're taking today are probably going to contribute towards getting that type of opportunity. But it's not something you can go and make happen by just calling them up and saying, "Hey, I'd like to be in your store." So as a result, you kind of get a little bit of like, okay, if you make a long-term goal, I want to be in Sobeys, let's say Q2 of 2024, then what do I need to do this week? And where do I need to delegate if I can, if I have or where do I need to prioritize within my own schedule to make sure that I'm actually taking steps towards doing that? Because, you know, 6 months from now, you're going to be thinking, wow, I actually need this many accounts and stores to make my business profitable, to make it grow. Well, the work that you do today kind of determines that. So it's very much about like setting out what kind of business do I want? Do I want a really big business? Do I want a business that's more of a lifestyle brand? Those are all great. But I think you have to be really intentional because they're not going to happen by accident. So it allows you to, I think, just on a weekly basis determine what's working, what's not. And you can get in front of issues much quicker than being 6 months from now being like, "Oh, I wish I'd done X, Y, or Z, and it's too late to do it now." So it's just allows it. I find that helpful because it simplifies things for me, which is really a complex thing growing a food business across Canada. If you can kind of simplify, okay, I need to know what I do this week to get a little bit closer, then it becomes a little bit less overwhelming. And I think that helps from a bunch of different perspectives, particularly for like mental health as well.
That makes sense, and I like the word that you used, intentionality, because that is a lot of entrepreneurs start with a vision. It's the simple thing,
Mm.
I want to share a better for you chocolate bar, but then, again, you get caught in the day to day, and you still have that key product that you're making, but to grow that to get to more consumers, it can be forgotten just again with that day to day. We're coming to the end of our episode, and I think that this would be a really good time to ask your advice. So, for those that are listening that might be some budding CPG entrepreneurs, what advice would you give them?
Great question. I think I would do if I was just starting a product idea. and it's not commercial, but I would do something like concept to market sprint. And we don't have the only program that's focused on like product ideation, but I'm somebody that naturally gets very, very excited about like new ideas, new products. And that I wish, having gone through the process of getting further down the road of, investing lots of money into something, I wish I could have just like had I guess just resolve to kind of at the beginning stages, even though I'm excited, just do the work of making sure that there is somebody out there that wants to pay for this product. Can I solicit their feedback much earlier through the product development process so that I don't have to tinker with it as much later? Because the further along, the more expensive that process gets. And then additionally, I would be open to feedback as much as I can, but I would also not be as reactive to feedback. Whereas, if you ask for feedback, you're going to get it. And the challenging thing is you might ask 20 people and they could tell you all different things. So ask the right questions, figure out what exactly you're unsure about, but still have kind of like, if you've done the work of figuring out, you've got a product, you've done a little bit of market validation, maybe you've done farmers markets, somebody's going to want to buy it. Maybe you've talked through people through a network like ours or any other entrepreneurial network where somebody can give you kind of some pointers on how to scale that product. I would do that work at the beginning because most of the time when businesses get down the road of investing a lot of money into figuring out if there's like a product market fit, it's just too late. And as a result, you've probably could have made some earlier corrections than waiting much later on to, keep hearing from retailer to retailer or getting into a retailer, because getting into a retailer is is half the battle, but actually getting the product off the shelf is what actually dictates success of a lot of these food brands. So dialing in on the customer through some sort of like market validation, customer feedback at the very early stage of your product development or journey as an entrepreneur, I think is so important. It starts with the customer, then figure out a strategy for approaching the Sobeys of the world and getting them to buy the product. Because a lot of entrepreneurs kind of go out of the perspective of I'll focus on the Sobeys and then I'll figure out the customer later.
Right.
But what inevitably happens is if you're savvy enough to get into Sobeys, it's innovative, it's different. They're looking for brands that are like that. But once you get on the store shelf, it sits there because there wasn't actually a real product market need, or you haven't communicated that well enough, or you haven't figured out how to meet your target customer where they're at with the messaging that they respond to. So that would be my key learning. The rest is stuff that you have to figure out the hard way a lot of the time, but just spend time at the beginning. I think what's that expression? It's like measure twice, cut once, or something like that. I think that applies in this scenario. Just spend a little bit more time at the beginning, just course correcting. You've got something, don't hold back.
Well, I think that's really good advice, and I'm gonna end it there. So thank you so much, Mike, for taking time to come on the show. I really learned a lot. This space is something that I'm continually learning about, even though I'm not an entrepreneur myself. I always find it really fascinating just to learn about the scalability of things, how things go. I think that although it's really cool to have a really good product, I always just find that journey so fascinating to scale up because there's so many things that you just don't even consider. So it was great to have you to come on the show and talk a little bit more about that, and as well talk about Venturepark Labs and all the amazing things that they're doing. So before I let you go, where can people find you?
Well, you can either communicate with me directly. I'm okay with giving my email directly because I seemingly get emails from everybody. So Mike at venturepark.ca. If you've got questions, I will either connect with you with someone on our team that can help, or I'm pretty well versed in what the different resources are across Canada. So be happy to connect there. And then learn more about Venturepark at ventureparklabs.ca as well.
Amazing. I'll make sure to share all those resources in the show notes. So once again, thank you, Mike, so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, so much for listening to episode 83 of the Food Grads podcast. All the notes to this podcast can be found by clicking on the Food Grads website and the Student and Grads tab. There, you can find any notes to past or future episodes. Once again, thank you to our partner, Careers Now, for their continued support of this podcast, so we can continue to deliver great conversations like the one you just heard. Canada is a fascinating place for so many reasons. On one hand, our country is huge and full of so many wonderful resources. The sheer amount and types of agriculture that we produce is mind-blowing, And I'm really proud of that. But as you heard from this conversation, the size can cause some problems as well. We are a big place, and the population density is quite irregular. So you'll have high population densities in some areas, while you'll have low in others. And because of this, it can cause a lot of problems in our supply chain. On a personal note, have you ever tried to ship around Canada? It is so expensive. I really enjoyed learning from Mike about the Canadian landscape and the challenges that are faced by entrepreneurs. Honestly, there needs to be more opportunity to grow the food space because competition is always a good thing, especially when it gives you access to so many awesome products. Ventureparks is doing a great job supporting these businesses, and if you do have an entrepreneur bone in your body, then don't just sit on it. Learn more. Many schools have programs and resources specifically designed to help student and alumni launch successful businesses. So even if you're just thinking about it, it might be worth exploring these options. It might even just fast track your career. Who knows, maybe when you're ready, you can even take the next step with Ventureparks. Anyways, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you everyone so much for listening, and I will see you next time.